In the cold winter of 1939, Europe stood on the edge of a nightmare. The world had barely recovered from the devastation of the First World War, yet the scars on nations and hearts remained fresh. Germany, under the iron grip of Adolf Hitler, was preparing for a campaign that would engulf the world in chaos. Across the Atlantic, America watched from a distance, still clinging to isolation, unaware that its destiny would soon collide with the forces of darkness. In a small village on the outskirts of Warsaw, Poland, a young boy named Tomasz lived a quiet life with his parents and younger sister. The village, with its cobblestone streets and wooden houses, seemed timeless, untouched by the political tremors shaking Europe. Tomasz's father, a blacksmith, had fought in the last war and carried its memories like hidden scars. He often told Tomasz stories of bravery and sacrifice, warning him that peace was fragile and could shatter in a heartbeat. Those warnings became reality on September 1, 1939. The roar of German tanks rolled across the border, and the sky was filled with the dark shadow of Luftwaffe planes. The invasion of Poland had begun. Villagers ran in panic as bombs rained down on homes and streets. Tomasz clutched his sister's hand, trying to navigate the chaos, while his mother shouted for them to hide. The first weeks were a blur of fear and confusion. Tomasz's father attempted to join the local resistance, but the German occupation was swift and merciless. Soldiers went door to door, seizing supplies, arresting those who resisted, and instilling terror wherever they went. Tomasz witnessed his first act of courage when a neighbor, an elderly man, refused to betray a hidden group of resistance fighters. The man was dragged away, yet his eyes burned with defiance, a lesson Tomasz would carry forever. Meanwhile, in London, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's government struggled to respond. The so-called phony war period left Europe in a tense silence, but the fear of Nazi aggression grew daily. Across the English Channel, French troops prepared for the inevitable confrontation, and ordinary citizens stocked up on supplies, bracing for a conflict that seemed both inevitable and incomprehensible. By the spring of 1940, Germany's blitzkrieg tactics had stunned the world. Denmark and Norway fell in days, followed by Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The world watched in horror as the Germans' combination of tanks, infantry, and air power overwhelmed countries that had prepared for a traditional, slower war. The fall of France in June 1940 left Britain standing alone against the Axis powers. Back in Poland, Tomasz and his family endured occupation with resilience. Food was scarce, fear was constant, and the village became a shadow of its former self. Yet, in the midst of despair, small acts of humanity and courage continued to shine. A group of villagers secretly hid Jewish families in attics and cellars, risking their lives for others. Tomasz watched these acts with awe, understanding that true heroism often came from ordinary people rather than generals or politicians. Across the oceans, in the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced mounting pressure. The attacks on Europe and the ongoing aggression in Asia raised urgent questions about America's role in a world at war. Isolationist sentiment remained strong, but the fall of France and the relentless bombing of Britain slowly shifted public opinion. It would not be long before America's destiny became inseparable from the fate of Europe. In the skies over Britain, the Luftwaffe began its assault in the summer of 1940, targeting airfields, cities, and infrastructure. The Battle of Britain had begun, and the courage of British pilots, the so-called few, became legendary. Tomasz, far away in occupied Poland, followed news from Britain with hope. The resistance whispered of heroic pilots who defied the odds, and these stories became a lifeline of hope in his otherwise dark world. By the end of 1940, the war had transformed from a distant threat into a reality that touched every corner of Europe. Families were separated, nations were conquered, and the future was uncertain. Yet even in the shadow of fear, small acts of bravery, defiance, and resilience reminded people that humanity could endure, even when the world seemed to collapse around them. Tomasz, now more aware of the harshness of the world, began to understand the lessons his father had tried to teach him. War was not just about battles and generals. It was about choices, courage, and the unwillingness to surrender one's humanity, even when darkness seems overwhelming. As 1941 approached, the storm of war showed no signs of abating. Across Europe, alliances formed and fractured, cities burned, and millions faced unimaginable hardships. For Tomasz, for Britain, and for the world, this was only the beginning. The stage was set for a war that would not only decide the fate of nations, but also test the very soul of humanity itself. As winter of 1941 deepened across Europe, the war was no longer a distant nightmare. It had become a daily reality. Tomasz's village, like many others in occupied Poland, was a place where silence often meant survival. The Germans had established strict curfews, and villagers whispered only in shadows. Every knock at the door could be a soldier demanding loyalty. Every unfamiliar face could be a spy. Despite the fear, the human spirit refused to bow. Underground networks had begun to form, linking villages across Poland in secret. Tomasz, now 13, was drawn into this clandestine world almost by accident. His father, having narrowly escaped arrest for assisting Jewish families, asked Tomasz to deliver messages between neighbors. The boy's small size and unassuming appearance made him an ideal messenger. Each errand, seemingly mundane, carried life-or-death consequences. A wrong word or misstep could mean capture, torture, or worse. One cold evening, Tomasz navigated narrow, snow-covered alleys to deliver a message to a hidden safe house. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single candle, and a group of resistance fighters pored over maps and coded letters. Their faces were etched with exhaustion and determination. Tomasz handed over his note, and one of the men, a former schoolteacher named Marek, looked at him with a rare smile. "Courage comes in many forms, young one," he whispered. "You may not wield a gun, but your role is just as important." Outside the safe house, life went on under the occupation. Soldiers patrolled streets with rifles slung over their shoulders, inspecting homes and arresting anyone suspected of defiance. Yet, in the face of oppression, small acts of resistance blossomed. Secret schools operated in basements and attics, teaching children to read and write in Polish rather than German. Families shared meager food with neighbors, and clandestine newspapers circulated, carrying news of victories and losses from other fronts. Meanwhile, the wider war was escalating at an unprecedented pace. Hitler's ambition had turned eastward. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun in June 1941. Millions of soldiers marched across the vast Russian plains, and brutal winter would soon turn the Eastern Front into a frozen hell. Tomasz listened to stories from travelers and radio broadcasts about the massive battles, the relentless artillery, and the harrowing conditions soldiers endured. For him, the world had become a map of conflict, each line drawn in blood and courage. In London, Winston Churchill's speeches rallied a determined nation. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall never surrender." His words echoed across Europe, reaching even the hidden corners of occupied Poland. Tomasz and his family listened in secret to the BBC broadcasts, finding hope in every syllable. The news of British resilience against the Luftwaffe reminded them that courage could ripple far beyond borders, inspiring those who had no army to fight with. As the months passed, Tomasz witnessed both the brutality and humanity of war. One evening, while returning from a message run, he stumbled upon a group of German soldiers mistreating a local family. Fear gripped him, but instead of fleeing, he ran to fetch villagers who managed to distract the soldiers long enough for the family to escape. It was a small act, almost invisible in the grand scale of the war, yet it left a deep mark on Tomasz's understanding of bravery. Courage, he realized, often came quietly, in moments of choice where one could act or do nothing. By late 1941, the United States had been drawn into the global conflict following the attack on Pearl Harbor. The war was no longer confined to Europe and Asia. It had become a truly global confrontation. Supplies, weapons, and hope began to flow from America to embattled nations. Tomasz's village heard rumors of American planes, tanks, and soldiers preparing to join the fight. Though the reality was distant, the knowledge that help was coming provided a fragile but critical sense of optimism. Even in the darkest times, small joys persisted. Children played in secret, families celebrated birthdays quietly, and villagers shared food and warmth. Tomasz's sister, despite the fear, managed to keep the family together with her laughter and energy. These glimpses of normal life became powerful reminders that humanity could endure, even when the world seemed consumed by violence. The resistance network also began to plan bolder actions. Sabotage of supply lines, interception of communications, and intelligence gathering became more organized. Tomasz, though still young, contributed in small but meaningful ways, delivering letters, guiding strangers safely through the village, and carrying essential supplies. Each act was a stitch in a vast tapestry of defiance that symbolized hope for the oppressed. By the end of 1941, the war had reached an unprecedented scale. Cities were burning, millions had been displaced, and Europe's fate remained uncertain. Yet, amidst the fear and destruction, ordinary people like Tomasz and his family demonstrated resilience, courage, and humanity. They understood that war was not merely about nations and armies. It was about the choices of individuals, the courage to act, and the determination to protect life, dignity, and hope. Tomasz, now more aware of the stakes, realized that survival was only one part of the battle. The other part was moral, the struggle to remain human in a world that often seemed inhumane. This lesson would shape him in the years to come, preparing him for challenges and decisions far beyond his small village. By the spring of 1942, the war had engulfed the entire European continent, and the toll on humanity was becoming impossible to ignore. Tomasz's village, once quiet and serene, was now a place where fear and resistance existed side by side. Every shadow could conceal danger, every sound could be a warning. Yet, the people had learned to live in this delicate balance between survival and defiance. Tomasz, now 14, had grown into his role within the resistance. He carried messages, guided travelers, and even helped transport supplies to safe houses in nearby towns. Each mission carried risk, yet each success reinforced a quiet pride that he had never known in his childhood. His understanding of courage deepened. It was not about glory, but about protecting life and preserving hope in a world that sought to crush both. One fateful day, a message arrived at the village that would forever change Tomasz's life. The Germans had begun mass deportations of villagers suspected of harboring resistance members or Jews. Families were rounded up, their homes searched, and loved ones disappeared into the unknown. Panic swept through the village like wildfire. Tomasz's own family prepared for the worst, hiding essential documents and supplies that could prove fatal if discovered. The resistance network acted quickly. Marek, the former schoolteacher who had become a mentor to Tomasz, organized a plan to smuggle at-risk villagers out under the cover of night. Tomasz was entrusted with guiding a small group through forests and abandoned farm paths to a safe location several miles away. The journey was harrowing. Snow and mud slowed their progress, and German patrols were everywhere. Every step required vigilance. One misstep could mean death. During the escape, Tomasz witnessed both the fragility and resilience of humanity. Families huddled together, children shivering but determined to survive, and elders offering encouragement despite their fear. Tomasz himself nearly fell into a frozen river while crossing a narrow ice-covered bridge, but a quick hand from his sister saved him. That moment of vulnerability reminded him that courage was not the absence of fear, it was action despite it. Meanwhile, across Europe, major battles reshaped the war. The Eastern Front had become a frozen inferno, with Soviet and German forces locked in brutal combat. In North Africa, the Allied forces faced off against Rommel's Afrika Korps in desert battles that tested endurance and strategy alike. Tomasz heard of these distant conflicts through clandestine radio broadcasts, realizing the war was no longer a series of local horrors. It was a global catastrophe. Back in the village, life continued under occupation, yet small victories kept hope alive. A hidden school taught children in secret, underground newspapers spread news of resistance victories, and villagers shared food and warmth in defiance of scarcity. Tomasz saw acts of bravery on a scale both grand and intimate, neighbors protecting each other, families risking everything to help strangers, and young boys like himself stepping into roles they had never imagined. But the cost of courage was becoming painfully clear. A German patrol discovered a hidden cache of supplies in a nearby barn. Several villagers were arrested, some never to return. Marek himself narrowly escaped, but he was left badly wounded, his face a grim reminder that heroism often came with suffering. Tomasz helped tend to Marek's wounds, realizing that the fight for humanity was as much about care and compassion as it was about daring missions. The summer of 1942 brought further news of horror from beyond the village. Reports of atrocities in occupied territories, the deportation of Jews, mass executions, and the cruelty of the Nazi regime were whispered among resistance members. Tomasz, though still young, began to grasp the magnitude of the evil confronting the world. Each act of defiance, however small, was a stand against not just oppression, but against the moral decay the war had unleashed. Yet, amidst the darkness, there were moments of profound humanity. Tomasz watched as a family shared their meager food with a stranger who had escaped deportation, and he observed the quiet pride of resistance fighters who risked everything to save others. These moments, though fleeting, reminded him that even in a world defined by violence and cruelty, compassion could endure. By the end of 1942, Tomasz had become more than a messenger. He had become a witness to history, a participant in acts of bravery that would shape the lives of those around him. He understood now that war was not only fought with weapons and strategy, it was fought in the hearts of ordinary people who chose courage over fear, action over despair. Tomasz's journey was far from over. The war would continue to test his resilience, morality, and understanding of what it truly meant to be human. But he now carried within him a lesson that would sustain him: the courage to act, the compassion to care, and the resolve to preserve humanity even when the world seemed determined to destroy it. By early 1943, the war had reached new levels of devastation. Across Europe, the Axis powers seemed unstoppable, yet pockets of resistance were growing bolder. Tomasz, now 15, had seen enough of fear to know that survival alone was not enough. Action was essential. Courage had become a responsibility, a shield for those who could not fight for themselves. The village had become a hub of quiet rebellion. Under the guidance of Marek, now recovering from his previous injuries, the resistance began more daring missions, sabotaging German supply lines, intercepting communications, and helping prisoners escape from nearby labor camps. Tomasz was no longer just a messenger. He assisted with planning routes, observing patrol patterns, and ensuring that essential supplies reached the right people at the right time. One night, a crucial mission arrived. A convoy of German trucks, carrying weapons and ammunition to the Eastern Front, was passing through a nearby road. The resistance saw an opportunity to strike, and Tomasz's role was to observe and report the convoy's movements. Hidden behind snow-covered bushes, his heart pounded as the headlights approached. The mission was dangerous. A single wrong step could expose the entire network. The sabotage was executed with precision. Explosives set along the road destroyed several vehicles, halting the convoy and delaying supplies. The Germans searched the area fiercely, but the resistance's careful planning allowed everyone to slip away into the forest. Tomasz, exhilarated and terrified, realized the weight of what they had done. It was not just a victory, it was a statement. Even in the face of a powerful enemy, defiance was possible. At the same time, news from other fronts painted a grim picture. The Battle of Stalingrad raged in the east, and the Allies were engaged in brutal fighting in North Africa. Tomasz listened to BBC broadcasts whenever possible, learning that the tide of war was shifting slowly. Britain had survived relentless bombings, and American forces were increasingly involved in global operations. These distant battles inspired the resistance, reminding them that their struggles were part of a larger fight for freedom, yet were always demanded a price. Soon after the convoy sabotage, German forces raided neighboring villages in retaliation. Homes were burned, livestock seized, and families arrested. Tomasz witnessed the consequences of defiance firsthand. Fear returned, heavier and sharper than before. The lesson was clear. Bravery came with cost, and the innocent often bore the brunt of resistance. Despite the dangers, the human spirit endured. Villagers shared food and warmth with those affected, hid fugitives in secret cellars, and continued to teach children in hidden classrooms. Tomasz's sister played a vital role in maintaining morale, reminding everyone that life must continue even in the shadow of destruction. Every small act of care, every whispered lesson, became a defiance of the cruelty surrounding them. As summer approached, the resistance began coordinating with other groups in larger towns. Tomasz was part of a small team delivering intelligence and supplies across treacherous terrain. The missions grew riskier, requiring nights spent in forests, freezing rivers crossed on makeshift rafts, and narrow escapes from German patrols. Yet each success strengthened the network, and each life saved reinforced Tomasz's understanding that the fight was not just about territory. It was about humanity. The winter of 1943 brought further challenges. Food became scarcer, and the constant threat of discovery weighed heavily on villagers. But amidst adversity, hope persisted. Stories of Allied victories filtered through secret channels. The liberation of North African territories, victories in the Pacific, and British raids on German positions. Tomasz and his fellow villagers drew courage from these distant events, reminding themselves that the world beyond their village was fighting too. Tomasz had also begun to mentor younger children in the village, teaching them how to move safely, read secret messages, and understand the importance of courage. He realized that resilience was contagious. Even the smallest acts could ripple outward, shaping others' choices and survival. The war had forced him to grow up quickly, but it had also instilled in him a profound sense of purpose. By the end of 1943, Tomasz's village had survived yet another year of occupation, resistance, and loss. He understood now that courage was never free, and heroism was rarely celebrated in its moment. But he also knew that the small, steadfast acts of humanity, the hidden classrooms, the safe houses, the shared meals, were victories in themselves. Each act preserved life, dignity, and hope, even when the world seemed determined to destroy them. As the year closed, Tomasz looked toward the horizon, knowing that the coming months would demand even more from him and his companions. The war was far from over, but the flame of defiance, once sparked, could not easily be extinguished. By early 1944, the war had reached a turning point. The Axis powers were no longer advancing unchecked. The Allies had begun to reclaim territories, and hope, long suppressed, started to flicker in the hearts of the oppressed. For Tomasz and his village, the cost of resistance had been heavy, but their determination remained unbroken. The village, though scarred by years of occupation and raids, had become a symbol of quiet defiance. Tomasz, now 16, had matured into a young man who carried the weight of responsibility and courage in his eyes. He had witnessed death, destruction, and betrayal, yet he had also seen humanity in its purest form. Neighbors risking everything for one another, strangers offering shelter and food, children learning in secret classrooms despite the danger surrounding them. In early spring, the resistance received news of a major Allied operation on the Western Front. The D-Day invasion was imminent, and German forces were increasingly stretched. Intelligence from Tomasz's network became vital, helping guide local resistance actions that disrupted German supply lines and communication. Each mission was dangerous, but the village had learned to move with precision, courage, and secrecy. Tomasz now played a central role, not just delivering messages, but coordinating small groups and ensuring the safety of civilians caught in the crossfire. One evening, Tomasz helped escort a group of escaped prisoners through forests toward a safe zone. The journey was fraught with danger. German patrols, frozen rivers, and treacherous terrain threatened to undo all their efforts. Tomasz led the group with quiet determination, keeping morale high with encouragement and courage. When they finally reached the safe zone, relief and gratitude were overwhelming. Tomasz realized that the true victory of the war was measured not only in battles won, but in lives preserved. As summer approached, Allied forces successfully landed in Normandy. News of the liberation of France reached even remote corners of occupied Europe, carried through underground radio broadcasts and secret messages. The morale of resistance groups soared, including Tomasz's village. The war, which had long seemed endless, was showing signs of turning in favor of freedom. Yet the final months of the war were still perilous. German forces, desperate and increasingly ruthless, continued to conduct raids and reprisals. Villagers remained vigilant, knowing that even a single mistake could cost lives. Tomasz's courage was tested daily as he balanced hope with the harsh reality of survival. Each act of defiance, each message delivered, and each life saved became part of a broader struggle for liberation. Finally, in early 1945, the tide fully turned. Soviet and Allied forces advanced across Europe, liberating towns and villages from occupation. Tomasz's village, though battered and weary, experienced its long-awaited freedom. Soldiers withdrew, and families emerged from hiding. The streets, once silent and fearful, now filled with cautious celebration. Survivors hugged, cried, and remembered those who had been lost. Tomasz looked around at his village, the ruins, the resilience, the community that had endured, and understood that courage, compassion, and defiance had preserved something far greater than buildings or borders: humanity itself. The liberation of Europe was not immediate or complete, but it marked the beginning of healing. Tomasz, his family, and the villagers began to rebuild, both physically and emotionally. The lessons of the war, the importance of courage, the value of community, and the need to act even in the face of overwhelming fear, remained imprinted on everyone who had survived. Tomasz now carried these lessons as a guiding force, determined to live a life that honored the sacrifices of those who had come before him. By the end of 1945, the world had been forever changed. Millions of lives had been lost, nations had been reshaped, and the scars of war were evident everywhere. Yet amidst the devastation, stories like Tomasz's shone as a testament to the power of human resilience. Courage was not measured in armies or weapons alone, but in acts of compassion, bravery, and determination to uphold humanity even in the darkest times. Tomasz's story concluded not with the absence of fear, but with the triumph of hope. He had seen the depths of human cruelty, but he had also seen its heights. The lessons of World War II were harsh, but they were clear. Freedom demanded courage, humanity demanded sacrifice, and even in the darkest moments, hope could endure.